Let's explore the geometry of God. And by God, let's also clarify God, goddess, which is the other side of the polarity, and all that is the synergy, that is what is born out of the polarity of God and goddess. So you can think of the parental archetype of the two halves, and then all that is as the children, what is created out of the two halves. So we'll just call that God, or GGA, God, Goddess, all that is. So the first thing to look at is that in order for God to be the most potent, the biggest, the most powerful, the most stable, the biggest, God has to include everything. In other words, if we look at the geometry of God, God could be the circle, or you can take the circle, you can cut it in half with language. It's called the knowledge of good and evil. You take the one and you divide it into two with language. And the way you do that is you conceptualize the world through polarity, through two distinct camps. You cut the one into two. And then of each two, you take a color, black and white, right? You can just have color, that's all that is. Or you can say on this side is black, on this side is white, and then from the I, the ego's point of view, you can identify more with one color than the other. So you just say, well, what do you like better? Do you like white or do you like black? Well, in reality, right? In reality, of course, you know, the Starlink Corporation has just retrofitted its satellites by painting them black so that they won't reflect light, so that astronomers can still do astronomy without having a reflective satellite, you know, bounce the sun's light and mess up the image, right? So the astronomer prefers black, right? And similarly, if you're building a solar, a solar heater for your swimming pool, you don't put a white reflective solar heater on the roof. You put a black solar heater that absorbs the heat, right? But similarly, right, if you're going in a spaceship to the moon and wearing a moon suit, you make that white so that the heat is not absorbed and doesn't cook you. It's right. So in reality, they're equal. You have uses for black, you have uses for white. But when you overlay that with a cultural stereotype, a cult stereotype, cult is the root word of culture, well then suddenly you can just pronounce. A cult doesn't need to rely on actual data. A cult relies on pronouncement, and it's usually the pronouncement of the leader of the majority, because the majority is going to follow in a herd-like manner certain leaders, certain, you have to follow something, right? So you don't just get a cult majority from nowhere, right? So there has to be certain figureheads, certain leaders. They're called influencers at the moment in social media, but there has to be someone at the helm, and then a majority will follow them. And that creates the cult-like dynamic because it's not referencing objective data. It's referencing the comfort of being unconsciously bonded with a majority. right? And so if you want that, and everyone is wearing sneakers that have a little swoosh on them, and that's the sneaker to wear, and and everyone's smiling if you're wearing them and talking about why you're not wearing them. Well, it's if once the cult has been set in a particular direction, then the need for love and belonging, the third in the hierarchy of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs, dictates that to belong, I want what everyone else has. They have those, I want those, right? And so in cult purchasing dynamics, the goal is to get a cult figurehead, someone who's considered good, who's blessed by the cult, right? So we like athletics, despite the distance, right? Because, there was a time where the athletic nature of a population determined who won a war, determined who plowed the most rice. There was a time when athletic was a key value relative to the technology of the day, right? But we're not in that time, right? We're in a time where people who don't plow fields, who don't fight with swords, and who don't ride on horsebacks, drive their car to a gym to simulate an old environment. But, cults are often slow to catch up with anything, and so we still deify the strongest person, which in the gender dynamic is going to be a male. That's why the Olympics are separated between male Olympics and female Olympics, because the strongest person is going to be a male. And, this also still has carryovers. Our obsession with the strength of the body rather than the strength of one's social skills, right? Because that is the world that we're actually in. But as a cult-like phenomena, the strength of our bodies is still elevated more than the strength of one's social skills. So we live in a social dynamic where social dynamics will determine 70% of your salary, will determine how happy you are, will determine the quality of your friendships, blah, blah, blah. That's the reality we live in. But we still live in a cult where the person with the best social skills is not given a gold medal, but the person who can farm rice, theoretically, by having the best muscles and, Mr. Universe, and, they're not actually out farming rice, right? They're not plowing the field, right? They're not defending the village against swordplay. They're just driving their car to a specially manufactured environment to move weights up and down, and then driving back again, and then driving their car to an award ceremony to see who theoretically would be the best rice farmer. And that's the cult we're in, right? And so if you're in a herd mentality, the hierarchies have been set by the majority, and you can either climb them or look at them in a bemused way, or you can, fail at them. You can do a variety of things, but they're there as part of the cult architecture. And cult architecture has very clear senses of what's good and bad, right? At different times in cult architecture, right? If you didn't go to church, if you said anything different from the Bible, you were bad, right? Because the cult was defined and formed primarily by the priests, right? And so, you didn't, Galileo, who looked through his telescope and said, it seems like the Earth is going around the sun. Right? Observation, that's science, was not the cult of the day. Right? The cult of the day was this book, and he was deviating, so he was a deviant. And so we are still a cult of cultism. And so if you think of the word deviant, oh, you don't want to be one of those. But you have to ask, what does it mean to deviate, right? First of all, divide, right? So to divide, you take the group, and now you divide the group into two. And the one who divides from the group and becomes an individual is deviating from the group, just as the group is deviating from that individual, because the group could, of course, follow the individual, right? The individual wakes up and says, why are we all reading this book? When we can look around us and we can see the things that correlate to human suffering and human well-being, and why don't we just learn about that and pay attention to our sensory data to reduce unnecessary human suffering? And why don't we start with the people who are suffering the most? Right? That's the ultimate goal, the ultimate expression of intelligence, is that since nobody wants to suffer, and since we are interconnected, the more this group of people suffer, over time, the more the species suffers, right? For example, if you let your homeless people catch viruses because, well, who cares about them, right? That's called sociopathic, but who cares about them? I'm a sociopath. Then what happens is the viruses breed. The best strains of that virus continue to cross-pollinate within a species that's cold, with a weak immune system, without support and without medicine. So the very best viruses breed within homeless populations that can't get medicine, that can't get warm and get healthy again. And then once they're bred within that population, they then jump to the less, the people with weak immune systems who are not homeless, which then spread it to everyone else. And so, Bravo, as a sociopathic cult, we breed the most virulent viruses in the least healthy, malnourished portions of our species. And then we send them around the world with, jets and et cetera, and we spread the virus. And we call it capitalism, right? So wonderful, let's breed the most virulent virus in this part of the population so that it can get strong enough and get a foothold and then jump to everyone else. And then let's spend trillions of dollars curing the virus rather than actually helping people to develop, have some organic vegetables, right? So that it doesn't breed and take a foothold and then jump the fence, right? And even antibiotic-resistant strains, it's the same deal, right? All of the antibiotic-resistant viruses that are currently breeding around the world are breeding in individuals who do not have the money and resources to get a refill in their antibiotics. So they take half a course, and then they get drunk to manage their pain or whatever, and then the antibiotic-resistant strain breeds in their body. And now the antibiotic-resistant strain spreads to everyone else, right? So bravo sociopaths, right? Bravo capitalism, right? You don't have the money? No money, no honey, right? Right? Now only, in this case, honey is medicine, right? So you don't have money for a taxi to get your refill of antibiotics, right? You don't have money to stay warm and fight the virus, etc. So, okay, the antibiotic-resistant viruses will all breed in you. And when they're strong enough, when the virus has penetrated the most vulnerable population and developed and learned all about the human frailty and the human body and how to take advantage of it, that's when it jumps the hoop. And so, there we are. And of course, we could become more like Hitler or more sociopathic by rounding up the poor or the sick and killing them, right? That's always an option. If we don't want to be human beings, the primary differentiation between a human being and an animal is empathy. The empathic brain and the rational empath, is what separates the human being from a reptile, right? And so the sociopath, that's going back towards reptile, and I mean, admittedly, if we could just kill, just build some gas chambers and kill everyone who's unhappy, everyone who's dissenting, everyone who's sick, everyone who's poor and homeless. I mean, the final solution, right? Once we've gotten rid of all those people, right, then we just have a cult of fear and terror, right? Because those groups that are reptilian always end up turning on themselves, right? So first, it was the sick and the mentally retarded that Hitler gassed. Well, you don't want to waste the gas chambers, right? So then let's expand that to Nazi dissidents, and then let's expand that to the Jews, right? But what would be next, right? There isn't a history of, mass murder apparatus just being retired, right? We form militaries, what's now the United States military-industrial complex. We form militaries at one point to respond to threat, but we don't disband them, do we? Second World War is over. Let's retire the military. Oh, no. Right? So we have to feed the machine, right? We have to go out and find a new enemy, right? We've built all these wonderful weapons. We don't just want to recycle them and pass out tinned soup to the homeless. No. We've got to find a justification for all of this weaponry. And so we got to get bigger. As the war ends, we get bigger, right? And that's, of course, the nature of identity, the nature of the I, the ego, that identifies with a role, with a pattern of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And so it wants to hold on to itself, right? I'm the warrior. Well, you're not fighting. Yeah, it's a problem, isn't it, right? These are bad guys over here. Let's go get them, right? Vietnam, halfway around the world. Got to get them, right? And so this is, of course, the nature of cult and culture, that we not only divide the one into two, and now you have two camps, and anytime you divide the whole into two, you have two equal halves. And of course, as soon as you go to war with half of yourself, with half of reality, it's a little bit of a waste of energy. It's like a tug of war. Let's take 100 people and divide them 50 each, and then let's have a rope, and you pull in this side and you pull in that side. And so 100 people spend a tremendous amount of energy and move a few feet, and they think this is intelligent, right? But that's the state of evolution today, is we divide the whole into the most excited, animated, reactive half, pro-abortion, anti-abortion, pro-this, anti-that, right? Whatever it is, right? And within polarity, there has to be, if you're looking through polarity as this is half of the world is good and half of it is bad, well then, you're on the good side, obviously. Right? It should be obvious to everyone that they're on the good side. And so they just need to, kill, waste energy pulling against the other side, right? So, this sociopathic stage of evolution breeds competency, right? Because if half the world is at war with the other half, only the strongest survive. The most paranoid, the most sociopathic, the most willing to endure pain, the strongest, the biggest, the wealthiest, they survive. And so in this way, and in this stage of evolution, life is breeding for competency. It's basically saying there's all these patterns of energy out there, and life doesn't know which one is the most efficient, the most, the ones that should go forward in life's evolution. And so there's a big battle, right? And at the end of it, 99% of all of life is dead, right? In the last billion years ago, 99% of all that has ever existed as a pattern of energy is dead, right? Most of the languages are dead, most of the cultures are dead, most of the plant species are dead, most of the animals are dead, the dinosaurs are all dead in the last billion years. So over a period of time, 99.9% of all that is dies and is transformed into a more efficient, more successful pattern of life, of thinking, feeling, speaking, doing, and being. And that more efficient pattern goes forward. On the other side of the war, right, the survivors continue to procreate, to create, and that's what goes forward. But coming back to God and the geometry of God, if you could pick, if we look at God as the most powerful, right, because God is ultimately an archetype that is evolving in our minds. And so our first effort, mirroring our own sociopathic period in history and in the period of the reptilian brain, was to divide the one into two, into the knowledge of good and evil, to fall from grace, because grace is the sphere, right? This is a graceful ride. You take this tire off and put on a tire that looks like that, and drive that in your car, put 4 of those on. That is not a graceful ride. If your engine is strong enough to get you off of this flat thing and back up on the edge and go around and bang down on the ground, that is such a painful ride. You do not want to go 70 miles an hour in that. You might prefer to walk, frankly, because your walking is more like a circle, right? Your legs are going, more like a circle. And so this is the descent into hell, right? The descent, the fall from grace, the fall from the ecological garden in which all things are connected into the knowledge of duality. That's taking a collaborative whole, dividing it, putting it into a tug of war, and moving a few feet, then getting up the next day and fighting again, right? It's pretty miserable. But you do build muscle through resistance and combat, etc. And so the muscle builds, and the strongest survive. So from that sense, do you want the ultimate expression of power, of grace, of all that is, to be half of reality, or do you want it to be whole? And of course, while it may be useful for mental technology to divide the one into many, you actually have a weaker God, a God that includes everything, is much stronger than a God that is male. You think of, all these bishops, etc. Where did they come from, right? The Pope, right? Of course, from a woman's womb, right? That's the science of it. And now we're in the scientific cult, right? And so as evolution takes place, we had the religious cult, and the religious cult created certain technology I mean, they had to write rosters. Who are the heretics that were going to be burned in the stake, right? Don't kill, but burn the heretics at the stake. That's also, when you have schizophrenia, you have a weaker state, right? Burn all the heretics, don't kill, right? That's you've divided your own brain there, right? One's pulling this way, one's pulling that way. Whichever way you do, once you've set the protocol, burn the heretics, don't kill, thou shalt not kill, burn the heretics, you've divided, you've become insane, right? Because you cannot integrate those two. Burn the heretics? Don't kill? Right. How many times does that have to go back and forth before you're absolutely stark raving mad? Well, that's a weakened state. And so if you can integrate, whenever you can integrate, you are increasing the grace, right? That's a pretty, comfortable ride, a circular tire. Not a triangular tire, a circular tire, an ecological tire, which the entire cycle of reality, the entire cycle of life is included. So that's the movement towards transcending the illusion of duality created by the illusion of language. The delusion of duality created by the illusion of language, right? Because language takes the one and divides it, right? This is red, this is orange, this is yellow, this is green, this is blue, right? Language takes the reality of the one, the color spectrum, and breaks it into the illusion, the delusion of separate colors. And the delusion is they're not really separate. They're on a continuum. And you can break the continuum up with language into 256 million colors, or you can just say it's color. It's all color, right? And so language is useful, but it is also an illusion, right? You don't get red without brown. You don't get brown without red. So they're not really separate. You say, I like red, I don't like brown. But you don't get red without brown. You don't get brown without red. They are connected in a color wheel. In a similar way, I like the flower, I don't like the root. Pick that lovely flower and get that mud out of the house, right? I like the flower, I don't like the root that produces it. So it's useful, like the flower then comes into the house and the mud stays outside. But we often confuse the things we divide up with language as actually being separate. That there is no difference when a root is required to give birth to a flower. If you truly don't like the root, you don't get a flower. It's just the way it is, right? And if you don't like compost, you don't get a flower, because that flower turns into compost. Right? I like food, I don't like shit. How's that going to work, right? How's that going to work, right? Because everything is a cycle. It's all a whole, right? So give me some food, but get that shit away from me, right? You're inviting the shit with every mouthful, right? And so there's a tension between ecology and reality and language and culture. And God is all that is, of course, transcends culture, is bigger than the patterns that can be construed in a tiny brain on one of trillions of life-affirming planet in the universe. So the next kind of thing, in that geometry, right? You can look at the possibility field also. You have a little disease in this part here, and you know that there's a cure. There's a cure for every disease. And so it's out here in the possibility field. Now, the bigger the possibility field, the more likely it is that the cure is within it, because the possibility field can be as big as you can imagine. It can be as big as every human being can imagine. It can be as big as every human being who has ever existed or will exist can be imagined. Or it can be bigger than that, right? We don't need to limit it to human beings' imagination at all. We can just let the possibility field be beyond, right? Not limited by what can construe in the human brain. And that is, of course, the biggest possibility field of all, right? Everything that we desire, everything that we want is possible, but it may not be possible for us within our limited system of beliefs, right? So the strongest God, the biggest God, is a God that includes all that is. So God got us all that is. And that is a circular, that is a spherical God, right? Because if you think of pursuing infinity in front of you and pursuing infinity behind you, arbitrary illusions created by language, the possibility field from wherever we are on the sphere, like if we're here, the possibility field goes out in all directions. And ultimately, the one comes back. Like if you send a plane flying right, like just send that plane flying east, 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 it will eventually go all the way to where we think of the east from where we are standing, and then it'll curve around the Earth. It'll come all the way back, and it'll arrive from the west, right? That's the dirty secret about the geometric connection of all illusionary dualities. If you pursue any extreme, you eventually come back from seemingly the other direction from your vantage point. Right? So you want the biggest world. You can also look geometrically at you can look at grace, the grace equation, right? What's the most graceful shape that there is to transport, to transform energy? And it's the sphere, right? You could have all of the weight of the world resting on a ball, then no matter which direction you needed to go, it could instantly move in that direction. You wouldn't have to turn a tire. That's a narrow circle. You'd have an entire ball being able to move in all directions. So the ball, or the sphere, is the most graceful, is the most efficient shape for transportation, which is why we move close to that with wheels. If you think of a table, right, you can divide the one into like the Trinity, an equal triangle, and you could say, okay, I'll have a table leg here, table leg here, table leg here, and so this will support the weight. And as you move towards symmetry, you move towards strong, so it's good that the weight, you know, if you took away this bit here and had two legs but nothing here, the table's going to fall over a lot more. If you have three legs instead of four legs, the table is going to fall over more. But ultimately, of course, if you had a leg on every single bit of the circle, that's the strongest table of all. So as you move towards symmetry, and the sphere is the most symmetrical shape that there is, you move towards strength, flexibility, potential. You move towards God got us all that is. Now, as you move towards ecology, that's the collaborative synergy of everything that is, helping everything else that is to exist, right? cells are helping molecules to exist. Molecules and atoms are helping cells to exist. There's all these different things that are helping one another. And if you took away the atom in that ecology, right, then reality collapses, right? And so you can create an ecological whole where one thing supports another thing that supports another thing, and the entire thing is like a woven fabric that exists because everything else exists. And so as you delete things from that, reality starts to collapse. If you delete subatomic particles, the atomic particles collapse. You delete the atomic particles, the molecules collapse. So there's an interconnected whole. There's a garden. Right? We eat the fruit of the garden. We vacate the fertilizer for the garden. That's the fruit that we give back to the garden. It's called fertilizer. That's a circle, right? And of course, it's a very it's a very efficient cycle. It's a wonderful thing. That's why it's been going sustainably for billions of years. The fact that it may be here 1 trillion years from now has to do with the fact that it's a cycle, which is a circle. It's not a, I'm going to deplete you of all your energy and then die. And then I'm going to deplete you of all your energy, and then you die. And then I die because I've got no one to deplete. So that cancerous relationship between bodies is not as intelligent, not as